we go. Hello, friends. Welcome. It is week 3, lecture 2. Today, we're going over APIs. There's a little hint of what we're going to do. As always, this code is currently on GitHub under week 3, lecture 2 solution. So if you do get lost or you do get sort of confused, then it is there. But that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to go ahead and kill this server and we will get started. Cool. There's a couple things that we are going to do. But before we do that, let's jump into some housekeeping. As always, you've got some discussion questions due on Sunday, February 26th. I believe that's Sunday. The other day, I wrote February 29th and then chuckled because I said, oh, there is no 29th of February unless it's a leap year. So that's funny. But February 26th by 11:59, make sure you get those done. And then you just have 1 week. This is a really, really, really great week to get caught up. If you are falling behind, if you fall below that 90%, please get caught up this week. All you have to do is this to-do list. I know a lot of you guys were already working on that last week. So please, please, please get caught up this week. Also, I just wanted to reiterate, I know that my calendar is a little bit crazy sometimes. If you guys can't get a hold of me, or if you go try to set a Calendly with me, but it is very full, like I think somebody responded to let me know today that the next opening was like Wednesday of next week. If that's the case, I just wanted to let you know there are tons of different tools that you guys I'm sure are aware of, but again, just want to reiterate, if I'm unavailable, you can go this one-on-one with any instructor. And this will take you to a Calendly link that you can put a time that is best for you. It goes into a round robin of instructors, and then it will give, it'll take an instructor that knows JavaScript and give you a one-on-one with them. So if I'm not available, there are other instructors that can help you as well. So that's one way. Gray is also available. So if you reach out on Discord, Gray can come and help you, which leads me to Discord. Discord's a great tool in order for you to sort of deal with, or ask your questions. Dojo Hall, which actually I checked today, realized this is not the correct link for Dojo Hall. I'm sorry, I'll change that. Give me 1 second. Dojo Hall, I'll change that right now. But Dojo Hall is a great place where TAs are literally sitting and waiting for you to come and ask questions. So if the case is that I am not available, please don't just say, oh, I guess I have to wait until next week. Instead, there's tons of resources, or shoot me an email. Also, if you guys say, hey, I'm really struggling, I really need to talk to you, but I don't see that there's any time until next Wednesday. If you shoot me an email, I can work around my schedule. Oftentimes I have things that I'm in meetings or something that are important, but I can sort of move around, or I can hop out of and get out of. But Calendly, you'll just see that as a meeting on my calendar. So if there is ever anything that you need specifically me for, shooting me an email is going to be really helpful for, and I can work with you, and I'll always try to help in every single way that I can. So cool.
And just to kind of add on to that there, post your questions in the chat. A lot of you all, it's your last stack before going to project and algos, and we're trying to get students more comfortable with asking your question in chat and or pair programming. So I'm not going to shout them out right now, but there's like 2 or 3 like students that are always in the Dojo Hall pair programming all the time, and we love seeing that. So if you guys are getting stuff, if anyone is getting stuff, please post your question in chat. There are TAs available, sometimes not always in the Dojo Hall because you have different shifts. But if you post in the chat and say, hey, at, Justina Gray, whatever, I'll get it and I'll be able to answer and so on and so forth. If I'm like currently either in a meeting or helping another student or whatever, but we're really trying to get students post their questions in the chat first, get comfortable with explaining what the problem is and how you're going to go about solving it. So if you're struggling, do not wait hours on hours or days. Post in the chat and then we'll talk with you. We're typically available 10 hours out of a day. You get some type of TA, 10 hours every single day. Pretty long time. So, just really iterating that. If you get stuck, please post your answer in the chat. Ping us. we'll get to you. So don't wait too long, but don't struggle in silence. So, but we're here. Yeah.
Well said, Gray. Yeah, you guys pay us to help you. So we want to help you as much as we can. Cool. Any questions or thoughts before I move on to our, actual kind of class and our topics today? Anything you need from a housekeeping or any questions on that? Clear as mud. Perfect. Cool. Well, today, what I really thought we would do is spend some time on an API and introducing APIs. I know that we had a pretty good discussion in class, or sorry, in office hour today about how some of this seems like it's in and out or kind of in out of order. And for that, I apologize. I actually agree. I think it is a little bit out of order. So I'm gonna, with your permission, go a little bit different than the other instructors and talk about some things. Like today, we're going to talk about use effect. We're going to introduce APIs. And then tomorrow, we're also going to talk about fetch. And then tomorrow we'll introduce Axios and then double down on APIs. But if you guys are struggling with that, please just know that within the next 2 days, we're going to really dive into APIs, deal with APIs, work with APIs. So that way you have a better understanding. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks. What I really want to do is look at some documentation as well, because again, having an API is going to be crucial, or knowing how to implement an API. I do it all the time. Like, it is an important task to learn and know how to do. So with that being said, let's actually dive in to what we call a REST API. Now, there's a ton of different types of APIs out there. Not a ton, but there are different types. One is going to be called a REST API. That's really going to be one of your more popular kinds. And what an API, before we even dive into the different types of it, let's talk about what is an API. An API is an application programming interface. Application programming interface, you'll never have to know that, but it's just going to be called an API. What that means is, and what it's very similar to is, let's say that I have got, let me annotate on my screen. I've got a user that is coming to, I've got a little grandma here, right? And they want to have some food. So here, we're going to come here, we're at a restaurant. So let's say we add in restaurant. So this whole thing is a restaurant. Restaurant, I think that's how you spell it. I'm not a speller. That's not how you spell it for sure. But I've got a restaurant, and then I also have a server. Let's see, which one would be server? Let's just say this one is our server, right? And so what happens at a restaurant is our little grandma comes in, sits down, the server walks over and says, "Hey, what can I do for you?" And the grandma makes what we call a request, right? The first thing that a server typically asks is, can I get you something to drink? What do you want? So the grandma makes a request for some iced tea. If they're anything like my grandmother, it'd be sweet tea. Technically, she lives in Dallas. The server goes, gets the request, and then goes to, let's say, the back and gets some tea, right? They get the tea, and then they go and they bring back what the person requested, right? What my grandmother requested. Now, if they have tea, then everything is working just fine, right? They go, and using emojis is way harder. So a grandma makes a request. The server or the waiter or waitress goes, gets that value or gets the drink, comes back and brings it back to my grandma or this grandma here. Now, let's say that, because this happens all the time. Oh, killed my grandma there. Tough. And the waitress. We'll just do these guys. This is gonna be way easier. 1, 2. We're gonna call this client. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is client. We're gonna call this waitress / server. Now let's say our client requests, or the person who gets to the restaurant goes and requests Pepsi, right? And then the waitress will probably know this. but they go and they say, okay, do I have Pepsi? Maybe this is where their food is. Food and drink. They're going to come back and say, oh no, we're a Coca-Cola person, right? We're a Coca-Cola restaurant, so I cannot fulfill your request. This here is what our API is going to be, right? It is something that goes, takes in a request. Oftentimes it's going to be an HTTP. There's other types, but HTTP is going to be a very popular type of request. And we'll see what that looks like here in a second. And says, okay, you've given me this request. What do you want me to do? And sometimes it is to go and get a drink. Other times it's to go, maybe this whole section is just drinks. And then we'll have another one for food. And I'll tell you why here in just a second. Maybe it's to get drinks. They come, the client's now hungry. They make a request for food. The server goes and gets my food. And so what it's basically doing is routing or getting my request and deciding what do I need to do with it. So here, this client, now let's get rid of the restaurant sort of idea. Our client is making a request to our API. Our API then decides, do I have the information I need to give it back to my client? Or do I need to go retrieve that information? Now, where I have food and drink might be another API, or it might be a database. It might be, it can be an Excel doc. I mean, which would be sort of like a database, but it could be a plethora of things. But basically, what it breaks down is our client makes a request, some sort of request to our API. Our API takes in that request and says, okay, you made the correct request, or I understand what you're asking me. Let me go and retrieve that. Cool, it's now retrieved it. Now let me take it back to my client and deliver that value. Does that make sense? I feel like me trying to use the grandma made it very confusing. So I'm happy to go through that again one more time if that didn't make sense. You guys put a 1 in the chat if this makes sense. Cool. Sorry, my grandma thing, I thought it'd be fun to use emojis. I was thinking about it all day today, and then it just threw me off. Cool. So from a high level, that is what an API does, is it allows us to make these requests. Our API has basically a framework. And when I say framework, I don't mean like a web framework. I mean like a blueprint would be a better word of, okay, when somebody requests this, here's where I go and get that. When somebody requests a drink, here's where the drinks are. Let me go and retrieve that. If they request a Pepsi, I can't do that. That doesn't make sense. Let me give them an error back. That is what an API from a high level allows us to do. Now, what a REST API does, or it's also called like RESTful, is basically it has a certain set of rules on how it operates and what you can ask it. And we're going to look at an API here in a bit that might make more sense. But it is a set of conventions or rules, and this is a very popular sort of way to do that, that allows us to ask certain questions to get some sort of information, and it is set in a certain way. So for example, here's going to be an API that we're going to deal with. This is what we're going to use today. Cool. This is called RecRes, and this is just request response sort of idea. This is a front end real API that we can get some information from. This is RESTful, meaning that there is a blueprint of how we can ask for certain things. If we want to get a user, if we want to get a single user, you see how let's talk about a few basic things with APIs. When you have an API, oftentimes what you're going to have is something called a base URL. This is the base URL is, okay, when you are requesting something, this is what all of them are going to have in common. Every single request that you make to this API must start with this. Here's our base URL. Then what we can do is create a way for me to interact with sort of the same topic in different ways. So here we have this /API/users if I want a single user. Now, if I want a list of users, you'll see that I still have users, but then I have this something called a query parameter, or what allows me to give query parameters. So it separates my URL from my query parameters. But you can see that they both have users in the request. And if this isn't making sense, when we actually start making requests, it'll make a little bit more sense. This is the idea behind RESTful, is that it just builds upon one another. So if you have anything to do with users, it's going to follow the same format where we've got this /API/users. So anything I'm doing with a user, if I want a single user, if I wanted to look for a specific user, and sometimes maybe they don't have that, anything I'm doing is going to, with users, is going to follow /users/something if I wanted, or if I just want all users, then I can identify which page I want. Okay. There are really 4 types of requests that we can make. We've got a GET request. And if you guys remember this from sort of use state, getting is just, I want to retrieve some information. And maybe if you guys have taken Python or you've taken Java, this makes a lot of sense to you. If you've not taken a full stack language, then this is probably a new piece of information. So please make sure, if you don't understand, that you ask some questions. A GET method is something that we are just retrieving information. We are reading some information. A post message, or method, sorry, not message, is when we are adding or creating some bit of information. You can think of a form. Anytime we do a form, it's going to be a post method, meaning, okay, I am giving you some information to create a new user, to update, to not update, but to create a new user, to create a new story or movie, right? Those are what we call a post request. Put is what we're going to do when we want to edit a file. So let's say I have a list of users. I will use a put method, and that is for editing. And then lastly, there's a delete. And these are the 4 most common. Delete, which is, as you can imagine, if I want to delete some sort of value, then I'm going to use that as my method. So here you have all these different, if I want to create a user, here it's still a post method. It still will follow the same idea, just how we create this, or the method that we use within our form or within our HTTP request. We can identify which method we want. That will alter what this is going to do. So although this list users and API users, other than if you get rid of the question mark in the page 2, they're the same thing, but because of their method. So this is GET, means I just want to retrieve information. But when this API receives a request to API users, but the method is post, it's saying, oh, you're wanting to create somebody new. Okay, perfect. I can do that. If I wanted to update them, then again, I will say API/users/to. And because anytime I'm updating, I want to be as specific as possible. So 2 is going to be like their ID, right? And so if I am wanting to update, I'll pass in the same thing as if I want to get, but based on the method I choose, that changes how my API operates. And then lastly, delete's going to look the exact same way, to where I can say API/users/to. But if I do a delete method, then it's going to delete that user. Kat in the chat said something great. Yes, this is our CRUD. Now, I haven't showed you how to do CRUD yet, because in my opinion, learning how to do CRUD without a database doesn't necessarily make sense. So once we start dealing with MongoDB, we'll show you how to deal with CRUD for right now. But we've sort of already done some of this, just not with this method aspect yet, which we're going to talk about this in MongoDB as well. So if this isn't making a ton of sense, we'll get to it. But for right now, just understanding that we can create these are all called, sorry, this is the idea behind a RESTful API, is whether I am doing single user, if it's a GET method or a put or delete, they can all be the same request. Just based off my method, it changes the functionality of my program. Okay. Are there any questions on sort of this idea for right now? How does it scale of 1 to 5? Is this making sense? Or 0 to 5, I guess? Okay, Colette, do you mind, or Katie, do you mind kind of coming off mute and kind of stating what doesn't? Or you can message Gray or I if you don't feel like coming off mute. I just want to make sure that we don't move forward until for that. Okay, perfect. Yeah, do that. Okay. So let's jump into actually what we are doing. So that is the idea behind this RESTful API, right? And we just looked at this RecRes API, right? So that's how an API works. We are making a request. Our API is identifying what type of request are we making. So is that a put, or is that a post? Is that a get? Like what exactly are you asking me to do? And then it's saying, can I do that? Does it follow the pattern? If it does, great. Then I can go retrieve information and give it back. And we're going to see how it does that here in just 1 second. Okay. So let's hop into our code. I think once we start playing with the code, it's going to make a little bit more sense. So let's hop into our code. I created this React app. I haven't done anything to it yet. We're just going to stay in this. It's not our movie. We're just going to stay in this though, because we don't need really much of anything today. Cool. So what I'm going to do is remember that there was this idea of a base URL. We're just going to use that, the RecRes, and we're just going to use this idea of a base URL. And I think this is an important thing to know. So let's just keep that, or it's something we're going to have. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put this in a variable. Base URL is going to equal this guy right here. Nope. Perfect. This is going to go up here. Cool. So I have my base URL. I'm ready to call my my API. Now, there's a tool within React that we're not supposed to go over until tomorrow, but I want to go over it now. It's another hook similar to useState, but it's called useEffect, where what we can do is we can add in useEffect. And what this basically does is if I have a component or multiple components that are based off of an API, you can sort of think of, let's say I've got a widget dashboard on my phone, or maybe not my phone, but on my computer. And part of it is with like my weather. And then there's the time in Shanghai. If I want to do that, oftentimes we're just going to call an API for that. Like whatever program I'm using is just going to make API calls. And so what I can do is I can use this hook called useEffect. And what it will allow is once this component is what we call mounted, and we can change it to unmounted, but mounted means that it's now been in the DOM. Once the code's been read and then it's in the DOM, it allows us to run and see or make an API request and get some information if we need. Now, not only does it allow us to basically make this request once the component is rendered or added into the DOM, but it also allows us to do this what we call asynchronously. And so what that means is that sometimes when we call APIs, you can think of like a Google Maps, right? When we call it, if we're being super specific or we're rendering something highly rendered, like a big map, then it might take a little bit of time. And right now, all that we've known and all that we've done for JavaScript is that it's been operating synchronously, meaning that it's going from top to bottom and it's waiting for the, if we call a function, it's waiting for that to be finished and then it goes to the next line. So if I were to have a function call and then under that is a console log, well, if I were to look at that, like if I were to have, you know, some sort of like a function, you know, some function that takes in a number, and then I just say num return num plus one. Oops. Cool. That's all that it's doing. And then I have a console log here. Console.log, you know, one. The way that it works currently is that when JavaScript reads this, if I were to have a function call, some function, it's going to take in this, or it's going to read this function. Once it reads this function, it's going to stop and go and do this function, right? This function, regardless of how long it takes, it's going to go. And once this is done, once line 10 is complete, then it will go on to line 11. Then it'll go on to line 11. What useEffect allows and what asynchronous code allows, because there's other ways that we can do it as well, that maybe we'll touch on tomorrow using like async and await, is we can say, okay, I want, like if I were to say, if I were to call this or create this as a asynchronous function, I think I go here. Regardless, if I were to want these to run concurrently, meaning that if this was an asynchronous function, while this is running, we're telling JavaScript, go ahead and go to the next line, because if this takes a long time, we don't want to wait, right? We don't want our code to be hindered or our user experience to be hindered because this function takes a long time, meaning go ahead and run things. It's called creating a new thread. Create a new thread and go ahead and start running line 11, even if this hasn't finished. So what useEffect allows us to do is exactly that. When we are making this request and we're getting this API, it does it asynchronously, meaning that we can do other things within my code, within my component, and it rendering or making another call. Let's say I had multiple useEffects, because you can have multiple useEffects within a component. Say, okay, I want this useEffect. I need you to go here and get some information. This one, go here, get some information. This one, go here and get some information. And it can do all of those simultaneously, versus if it wasn't asynchronous, then it'd say, okay, you go get information, but you guys wait until this one comes back. Okay, now you go and wait. And then everybody else waits until that one comes back. And so what useEffect allows us to do is to go and get that information asynchronously so that our user has a better experience and things load well. Does that make sense? Okay. So the way we write it is by using useEffect. So I'm going to say useEffect. Now, one thing to know is if we're going to use useEffect, we've got to bring it in just like we do with useState. Just like we do with useState. And in fact, we're going to use useState. So I'm actually just going to do this. So now, since I brought it in, I can now officially use useEffect. Now, this is a higher order function, meaning we've got a callback function within this. And there's a couple things that I can do. Here you can see tomorrow we're going to change this. We're going to use a tool called Axios, but for today we're going to use something called fetch. And what fetch will do is it allows me to actually put in a URL, that I want it to query. So right now, here's my base URL. And then I'm adding the string of users, which if you look here, I just want to do this one. So I'm actually going to change this to this guy. Users question mark page equals 2. Cool. So what this, I'll just show real quickly. This fetch is actually just doing this. That's what this is, fetch is doing. And this is, so when use effect is running, right? When we have use effect upon this being what we call mounted, it's going to go and it's going to go to this URL. It's going to make my API request to get some information. Now with this, we get a few things back, and let's actually just, let's just console log. I want to be able to show you exactly what we're going to get back here. Response equals, just want to do response. I don't need this. Cool. Now let me come here. So use effect has two, or fetch, sorry, has two different pieces that we have to deal with. I'm wondering if it's going to say, yeah. Our then, and then the next one is going to be a dot catch. Now what this is doing is if our request is good, meaning that, okay, everything works, we're good to go, then I want to take the response, which is just what we're getting back. We can call this unicorn if we wanted. And then here I'm going to console.log. Here's what I want to do with this. Perfect. So I just want a console log response. If there's an error, meaning that we are trying to request something that does not work, that does not sort of operate, then that's what this catch is for. You can kind of think about this as an if else. I'm fetching, I'm making my API request with this information. If everything is good, then my API is going to give me back my information that I requested. And we're going to call it response, and I'm going to console log it. If things are bad, if it's a bad API request, then what's going to happen is I am going to get, I'm going to get an error, and I want to go ahead and console log it so that way I can see that there's an error. Now there's something else that I'm missing. I'm missing my curly bracket. Let's see.
The other side of the parentheses.
The other side.
To the left.
Oh yeah, sorry. And then, because there's something else I
And then
need
the
to do.
array.
Yeah. So then, and I'll talk about this here in just a second. Cool. So let's go ahead and spin this up. Again, once it spins up, what we should see is that this makes a request to here. We should either see a response or an error if our request, or if our request works. So let me spin this up, CD into API React and start, and then we'll start looking at exactly what we can do here. Okay, so we don't have anything because we're not seeing anything, but let's go ahead and inspect. If I go to console, here I got this response. Now, again, we get it twice. But in this response, we have now made our request to this URL, and I'm getting a whole bunch of stuff, right? But here I get this body readable string. And this is an issue with fetch, or not necessarily an issue, but this is just sort of why we're going to not use fetch and we're going to use Axios. Is when we see this, this is really all that matters that I'm going to need is the body of the response. If I'm looking here, this is what I should get back, right? This is the body of my response. This is what we call a JSON payload, which is just basically a JavaScript object, which is JavaScript object notation. That's what JSON stands for. Just a bunch of key value pairs that I can look. And I want to see this data piece, right? This is really all I care about. I'm just wanting to get these users. Now with fetch, what I have to do, one extra step, and you kind of saw it at the beginning, is I have to say response.json. Say, okay, I want to convert this to JSON. Cool. But now, so let's see if I console log this. Let's see what this looks like. Console.log. I come back. I refresh. Cool. I get this promise. Pending, promise pending. I get this object, and then within this object, I get this guy right here. We get this guy right here, this data piece, right? This is what's important and this is what matters, right? This is the portion that I want. And I just had to convert that into a JSON object or JavaScript object. Cool. So now what I can do is I can say then, and because I've done this, and this is giving me and returning a JSON object, I can chain this then and say data equal console log data. But I don't want console log data. I'm going to call this JSON just so we have a better understanding. I'm going to say JSON dot data. We'll get to what that is doing here in a second. Cool. So now if I come here, you can already see that now automatically I get this array of objects. That's got an ID, that's got an email, that's got a first name, a last name, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want you to see that there was this word called promise here. This word called promise. And I misspoke. I said that the use effect is what allows us to run things asynchronously. Yes and no. Use effect allows us to query, but then it uses something called a promise to run things asynchronously. And so the promise within this, I'm trying to find it on the platform.
It was the second one down in APIs.
Oh yeah. So the promise in itself is what allows it to run asynchronously. And what is a promise? A promise is just a pattern where we make some sort of request, or we have this function, and then we'll get a response from it. So this idea of our fetch, the then and catch, is this idea of a promise right here, right? Fetch is my promise. I have a then I have a catch. This is what allows my code, this guy right here, to run asynchronously. Use effect allows me to run this code immediately. Fetch in itself is my promise that allows me to run things asynchronously so that if this takes a long time to load, we can, if this takes us a super long time to load, then it can move on to whatever it has, or we have a bunch of components, then it allows us to do that, kind of instead of waiting for it to finish, it allows us to do it immediately. Now, the platform is good at showing you sort of what a promise is. And there's a great video if you're looking at these lectures or the lecture videos. Instructor Caden does a great video that goes pretty in depth, in my opinion, on promises. So I think it's week 3, day 2. Goes pretty in depth on promises. If you guys are curious on them, it's a really great video because he goes in depth in the sort of the different ways that you can write a promise. In my opinion, you're not going to write a ton of promises. What you're really going to do is handle promises most often. So like out in the development world, you're not really going to like write your own promise as much as you're going to handle and know how to work with promises using fetch or Axios. So that is what I would say if you want to learn how to sort of write these, he's got a great video for that. Again, knowing how to work with them is going to be the most important thing. The main thing about it is knowing that a promise allows you 2 things: to run code asynchronously, so side by side, multi-threaded. What it also allows you to do is allows you to handle any sort of errors that happened. So here right now, all we're doing in our code is console logging if there's an error. That's it. Like if I were to say, if I were to actually do this and save, let's go see what happens. Now we're to refresh. Oh, interesting. That should not work. So we should get an error. But I'll look at this in just a second. Why is that not? I'm gonna stop this. That shouldn't work. Hmm. Ray, are you seeing why this is working?
Maybe it's actually there. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't
I
think so.
guess. Let's try
I was
that.
like,
What if you just delete users?
Yeah, let's try
that's
that.
interesting.
Does not make any sense.
But maybe it's still
Okay.
picking up. Oh, there you go.
So I have no idea why it was able to get from users, but what's interesting though is it wasn't. I wonder if there's something weird that I was able to get, because if I look at users, so watch, let's just test, sorry. If I were to say users and come here. Now I get this. Michael Lawson. I get like an actual user. What it was returning me is this weird sand dollar year color Pantone. So I was making some weird request and it was still giving it, somehow it worked.
Maybe you
Yeah,
have, like, a
honestly, Jonathan.
partial. Maybe you have like a partial like API that can recognize certain things.
I don't know. That's super weird. It should not have worked. Maybe it is an Easter egg. I have no idea. That's tripping me out though. Okay. That does not make any sense. But what I wanted to point out is right here, we are getting an error, right? A 404, which saying page does not exist, right? And so for right now, all we're doing is we are printing that. If I wanted to actually handle some sort of value, say, okay, if there is an error, then maybe redirect them and say, are you, did you mean to put this or can't find the page, right? Or a 404 page, if I wanted to render that some sort of component to do that, I can do that in this catch. Those are the main things to know is how do we handle, what are we going to do when the request is good? When we have that, and this is cool, we've made a good request, we got a response back. What do I want to do with it? And then if there's an error, how am I going to handle that? That for this course, that is going to be the biggest thing of promises that you need. Again, there's a video that Caden did that allows you to sort of kind of go more in depth on that. You're welcome to look at that. You have access to it. But this is really, this is our promise and this is use effect. Now, you might be wondering what the heck is going on with this guy right here. Why did we have to add? Here's use effect and it has two things, right? Takes in this guy and then it also has this comma and this array. This is what we call a dependency array. And so if you don't have it, will it technically work? It might, but what can happen is you can actually get in like, it's called callback hell or an infinite callback loop to where it's going to continuously run and you're going to sort of break your code. What this is really doing is you remember when I was talking about sort of something being mounted or unmounted or something being added to the DOM is because we can have multiple use effects. I can actually say, okay, I want you to run this upon once entering the DOM and it's mounted. That's good. But then anytime X value or some component is updated, then I want you to run use effect again. And I want you to do this. I want you to do all of this again. And so what would go in here if we wanted it to would be, we could put a component to say, once this is updated or once this changes, then I want you to update this that way. So like here's an example of this right here. right? You can have in this component, you've got a my component. It's got a state of count and a state of user, and you can have multiple use effects right here. Where this one, this use effect only runs, where now it's going to say now the count is now when count. Once this value is affected, so once the state is changed, then okay, I want you to run this code. Or if I do some sort of, I change the user, then now I want you to run this code again. That's what that allows for us to do. Or if you just say upon it being mounted, so it's just starting, go ahead and leave that empty. And you can just leave it empty for sort of what we're doing. But that's what that is doing, is allows us to have multiple use effects and only change when there is something being updated, in this case, the state of count or the state of user. Yeah, Chris, that's sort of a great way to think about it. It's listening and saying, okay, when state is changed, then this is also part of the process. This is changed, then go ahead and run this again. Yeah. Somebody asked, but why is the line to the left not indented like the one? So Katie, I know you're asking, I think you said maybe from Python. Python is really big on code block, right? And so, because that's how it knows that code's attached. So in this case, for example, these .thens are indented under fetch, and in Python, based off of that indentation, that's how it knows that these are associated with fetch. This is just a nice way to write it. I could have this. I just think it's gross looking. This all works too, right? It's all the same thing. The way JavaScript works is Python uses those code blocks. JavaScript uses curly brackets.
It's just
That's
that the curly brackets are all the way, they're like one indentation to the left of the use effect. So that's why I was confused.
Oh yeah, no, it doesn't. JavaScript
It doesn't matter. Okay.
No, just Python. And that's because Python doesn't have anything to indicate. So that's what it uses is the tab to indicate, okay, this is associated to this. But in JavaScript, it doesn't matter. They could all literally, it'd be disgusting looking. They could all literally be basically the same thing. As long as
Gotcha.
there's curly brackets, that's what identifies that. Great question.
The JSON in line 12 could have been anything, right?
Yes.
So you didn't have,
Yeah, it could be
Okay.
unicorn.
all right.
Yeah. This is returning this guy. And similar to how we talked about in class with map or in office hour. So we're going here. If things are successful, then I'm taking the response and I'm turning it into JSON. And that's what I'm returning. Then I chain this and saying, okay, cool. If this is successful, then I want to console log the data. Perfect. And it's taking this value that's being returned and putting it here. Again, Axios tomorrow does this for us. So we actually don't have to have a double then. That's sort of that's one of the nice things about Axios. But Axios tomorrow, we're going to deal with like gets, requests, post requests, stuff like that. This catch is just my error if there's an error like we saw earlier. Okay. How are we feeling about this? Use effect is my hook, allows us to run this immediately. This fetch is a promise. We're going to this URL. If things worked out well, then we get a response or we get something back from this request. We're going to call it response. We make it JSON. Then we take that JSON. We're going to console log it. We're going to do something with it here in a second. But if there is an error, then we console log it. And again, this allows us to do other things while this is running in case this is a little bit beefier of a request and a change. Gray, were you talking?
Yeah, just when you talk about the dependency array, I don't know if my rule of thumb will be helpful, but I know that so that was something that was really confusing. When it comes to here, would the student typically just put in the state? So kind of like when to include a dependency array, when not to include it. Like I'm not gonna say this will happen all the time, but typically like I put the variable, the state that I'm trying to change. So, and I don't know if I put all of them or depending on what I'm doing, but kind of talking a little bit more about like that part, because I know that confuses students a lot when it comes to like what to put in here when they start introducing
Sure.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say for right now, you can leave it blank. Again, similar to this, if we have a use effect or we're wanting something to happen, and we'll get into this as we're starting to build our full stack applications. If we're wanting something to happen where you're right, a state is updated, then yeah, you could throw in use effect. And again, remember, you can have multiple use effects within. This is just saying, okay, run this immediately and then also check when this is updated. To where you can have multiple. And if we were just saying, I'm trying to think of a way that we want to update state immediately. If we were to have like a total for, let's say, a banking application, you probably wouldn't do it this way. You'd make a request to a database, but that's okay. Let's just say for this stance that I wanted to make a deposit every time total money has changed and that deposit, went in and set my amount to amount plus whatever I just deposited. Anytime that amount changes, then I want to show that new amount on my screen. Yes, you could throw in that for state. I would say right now, just getting used to just putting curly brackets, or sorry, not curly brackets, array sort of brackets is perfect. Just keep that there. Just make sure you add that in. Any other questions? Okay. Well, so we're able to see that we can see this data, which is nice, but let's actually do something with it with the tools that we have currently learned in this. So, or currently learned with React. So if I wanted to maybe show all of my users on this page, right? Right now it's just a blank white page, but I wanted to show in this, we're going to get a couple different things. We're going to get an avatar, an email, a first name, a last name, and then we have an ID. If I wanted to do that, what could I do? What tool could I use? Like, what are my next steps? I want to show those values on the page here. Anybody know?
You could add state and
State,
set
yeah,
the JSON to the response from the JSON to state.
100%. 100% I could do that. So let's say I say const. I'm going to say users. Wow, it already knew that. Whoa, that's weird. Okay, GitHub Copilot's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to create this state where I'm going to have this users or set of or list of users, and it's just going to be just an empty list. And then what I want to do is, just like Jonathan said, I'm going to eventually want to map through that. So in here, I'm just going to say, I have this div, I'm gonna say users.map. Just go ahead and say, let's just let it do its thing. Perfect. Oh, and I need to close my div. Cool. So what we're going to do is we are going to map through all of this information. Yep. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Perfect. There we go. Okay, so I was missing a parentheses. I have my users that I'm going to have, my users list. I'm going to map through them, right? For each one is going to represent one user. Now notice my key GitHub Copilot new is going to use this ID that we got. Now our ID is our unique identifier. It's not the index, but it's the ID of my user. So that's awesome. Oh, I got an error. We'll get to that here in a second. And then it's just going to create a H1 for the first name. I'm actually just going to do this. Do X. Username, last name, that's fine. And then we also have this avatar here that we can see, which is a image. And so I can just set an image and my source is the avatar. And then the alternate, which is great for accessibility. You always want to make sure you have an alt, but that allows you to then you have your accessibility. That way, if your image for some reason does not show up, then you can that's what this is. Then you should be good to go. Wait, where am I off? Oh. We
I think the parentheses and the curly bracket are flipped. I think parentheses needs to be on the left, curly bracket on the right.
That. It's not, I have my solution here and it's showing this exact.
You don't need the one on 26.
That's what I had. Oh, there we go. Okay. But it's not mapping through anything. Anybody know why? So we're able to map. Or we have this code set up correctly. Thanks, Alan, for the parenthesis curly bracket help. Anybody see why it's not showing anything?
Because in line 13, we're console logging it instead of setting the user to the
Yeah,
JSON.
exactly. Exactly. So what I can do is actually, instead of just say console log, I can say set users. And then now, if we come here, I'm able to call this API, get this information, and I'm able to get all of these unique people, just people, show their information on the screen. And if I were to change this, like let's say this, let's try page 1. See if that changes anything.
And that's
Yep.
fine. I'm just not used to,
Nope.
yeah. And also you have to pay for it. Which
Do you mind?
I tried to
Katie, it
download
looks
it.
like
I was gonna have to pay.
Katie, it looks like you're, yeah, thank you. Cool. So we're able to call this information from our API. We're able to fetch it, get the information, transform it into JSON, get the data that we want, take it, set our user state or set users, use this function to set our user state, and then eventually map through it and show it on the screen. Any questions on what we did today?
I wanted to add something real quick.
Yeah, of course.
In the, could I see the code real quick? Yeah. I was doing the Pokemon assignment and line 14, I didn't add it and it's still working fine. Is
Mhm.
that so just we're able to see the errors, or is that adding any other functionality to the code?
Yeah, so it's basically like there's another one called a try catch. And so what you would want to do is if your code doesn't work, let's say you do get an error
Mhm.
and you're not handling that. So this idea of called error handling, then your project's just, like your program's just not going to work. And so the idea would be
Gotcha.
if there is an error, let's say a user makes an error like myself, I put 2 S's or something like that,
Mhm.
then how do I want to handle that? Or if that data no longer exists, if a user, with a first name or, whatever no longer exists, how do I want to handle that?
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. So like here, it even talks about single user not found. It's going to give you a 404 response. And so if we get that response, we can basically say, if, it is 404, then we can show some sort of component, or we can show something that says, I'm so sorry, user not found. Are you sure that the name is correct, or something of that nature?
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah, Caden does talk about try catch in that other video as well. Kind of goes a little bit more in depth on promises and try catch. Maybe I'll talk about those a little bit more in depth tomorrow as well. Now we're moving forward. We're going to use this tool called Postman. So if you guys can download it, it's in the Express. It's in the Express section, but it's just a really, really great tool. It's free. You can upgrade, but you don't need to. That we can make these requests on our own. That way we can test and see data, because there's lots and lots of different APIs that we can call. Here's a great list here. I'll put this in the chat. And this is just a bunch of free APIs. So APIs are, again, all over the place. But if you wanted one about development, all kinds of different things with weather, with Google Fonts, with API to read, write, and format Google Sheets data, we can handle all that. Yeah, there's tons of different things. Now, within that, there's going to be, if you're starting to mess with it, this API key is basically a way that they know who is making the request. And so it's also a way oftentimes that they charge you. And so that if you are wanting to deal with this, especially if you're messing with it, then you can look at this one that have no APIs. So if I click here, cool, board API, I've got my base URL. Here's an activity, and this is what this is the response I have back. So now I know when I have my JSON file, if I want to show the information, I can do this. Or checking out the documentation, we can have participants, you can have all kinds of different things, price range, where you can change that. But it all starts with the same base URL. So there's lots of cool things that you can do. There's a Pokemon one, a Star Wars API that is really popular. Most instructors go through this one, which is a really, really fun one. Here's our base URL and the different things that we can do. I can say people1/1, and this will be my request, and then gets me Luke Skywalker, and I can then show that information however I want. Any questions on this? There's another one as well that Alan showed in office hour called Rapid API. There's a bunch of different things you can do with that. Talks a little bit more about APIs. Okay, that's all I have. How are we feeling with APIs? Is this something you want me to touch up again on tomorrow? We're going to start dealing and building our own, but I feel like I was kind of off ever since my whole grandma debacle. So sorry if this wasn't the most engaging or sort of. If you felt like it was a little off, I also do feel that. So I'm so sorry about that. Any questions before I turn off the recording? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.